my family treated Uncle William like a broken, guilty ghost for 20 years. Until I found the secret folder proving he took the fall for my dad and let us hate him to keep us all together. I'm 29, and for most of my life, my Uncle William felt less like a real person and more like a warning. Every family has that one relative nobody explains properly. In ours, it was him. He was my dad's older brother, and he was always there without really being there. He'd show up to weddings in the same dark jacket no matter the season, stand near the back, say almost nothing, and leave before dessert. At Christmas, he brought gifts that were weirdly thoughtful and too expensive, then sat in silence while everyone else laughed too loudly around him, like they were trying to prove they weren't uncomfortable. Nobody ever told me to avoid him. They didn't have to. Kids notice things. The way conversations died when he entered a room. The way my grandmother's mouth tightened when his name came up. The way my dad called him your uncle instead of Vic, like there was distance built right into the title. When I was 8, I asked my mom why Uncle William never stayed long. She was setting the table, not looking at me, and she said, "Some people make their choices and then have to live with them." That answer sat in my head for years. When I was 12, I asked my dad what Uncle William had done. Dad took too long to answer. Then he said, "He hurt this family. A long time ago. Your grandmother forgave him enough to let him visit. That's all you need to know." That was the official version. Uncle William had done something bad. Bad enough to break the family. Bad enough that even after all those years, nobody could say his name without sounding tired. So I built him into something bigger than a man. He became the reason my grandmother flinched whenever old stories got too close to the 80s. The reason my dad hated unanswered questions. The reason Thanksgiving always felt tense for no clear reason by the end of the night. And still, William kept showing up. That was the strange part. If he was really the villain everyone quietly agreed he was, why come back at all? Why drive 2 hours for birthdays where nobody sat next to him? Why hand my little sister a carefully wrapped art set because he remembered she liked sketching? Why fix my cousin's dead battery in the snow without being asked, then leave before anyone thanked him? It happened over and over. He'd appear, help with something, speak maybe 10 words, then disappear. Once when I was 16, I caught him standing alone on our back porch during Easter, looking through the kitchen window at everyone inside. My family was laughing around the table. He wasn't smiling. He just looked relieved, like seeing all of us together was enough. When he noticed me watching, he nodded once and left. No explanation. No goodbye. That was William. A ghost with a driver's license. By the time I was an adult, I'd stopped expecting answers. Family myths harden like concrete. You grow around them. Then last fall, after my grandmother's 75th birthday dinner, I found a box in my dad's garage. And everything I thought I knew about Uncle William started to crack. My grandmother's birthday was the kind of family event that looked warm in photos and felt exhausting in real life. 30 people squeezed into my parents' house, kids running through the hallway, my aunt criticizing the catering, my cousins pretending not to hate each other. By the end of the night, the kitchen looked like a battlefield of half-eaten cake and wine glasses with lipstick stains. Uncle William came, of course. He arrived early, carrying my grandmother's favorite bakery cheesecake before anyone else had shown up. He wore that same dark jacket, nodded at everyone, kissed my grandmother on the cheek, and spent most of the evening refilling drinks, taking out trash, and staying out of every conversation longer than 2 minutes. He gave me a firm handshake and said, "Heard you got promoted." That was it. He knew about my promotion. None of my cousins had remembered, but he had. I thanked him, and he nodded like he'd completed an obligation. Later, I saw my Aunt Paula ask him to move some folding chairs from the garage. No please. No smile. Just the assumption he would do it. He did. That happened with him a lot too. People distrusted him, judged him, whispered about him, but still leaned on him whenever something needed fixing, lifting, paying for, or quietly handling. He never complained. Near the end of the party, my younger cousin Jenna knocked over a full glass of red wine onto the cream-colored rug. Everyone shouted at once. William moved first, grabbed towels, lifted the table, blotted the spill, and told Jenna in the calmest voice in the room, "It's a rug. You're fine." She stopped crying instantly. Then my aunt pulled her away from him, as if comfort from William somehow counted less. I saw his face then. Not angry. Not hurt exactly. Just used to it. He left around 10:30, before the family started the ritual of arguing over leftovers. My grandmother hugged him longer than usual. He whispered something in her ear that made her eyes shine, and then he walked out the front door into the cold. I was one of the last people still helping clean up. Dad asked me to grab more paper towels from the garage. The garage was cluttered the way garages become when a family has lived in one house for decades. Paint cans, old tools, broken lamps no one planned to fix, boxes labeled in my mother's faded handwriting. I found the paper towels, but while reaching for them, I bumped a stack of old storage bins. One tipped over. A cardboard box slid off the shelf and burst open on the floor. Papers spilled everywhere. Most of it looked like junk at first glance. Old bills, envelopes, a few photographs. I knelt to shove it all back in before Dad noticed I'd made a mess. Then I saw a newspaper clipping. The headline had been cut out, but the article mentioned a fire at a warehouse on the edge of town. No fatalities. Financial investigation pending. The date was from 1998. Scrawled across the top in black ink were 4 words. This is where it started. Not printed. Handwritten. I recognized the handwriting immediately. Uncle William's. My stomach tightened. There were other things in the box too. A faded photo of my dad and William as young men standing beside a delivery truck. Illegal envelopes stuffed with copies of checks. A motel receipt from another state. And beneath all of it, a sealed manila folder with one line written across the front. For Daniel, when he's old enough to understand. Daniel is me. I just stared at it. My dad's voice came from the kitchen, asking what was taking so long. I shoved the loose papers back into the box, but not the folder. I slipped under my arm. I brought in the paper towels, acted normal, finished cleaning, and drove home with that folder on the passenger seat like it was alive. I didn't open it right away. I should have. Maybe then I would have understood why William had spent 20 years letting everyone hate him. I opened the folder at 1:14 in the morning at my kitchen table with a beer I forgot to drink. Inside were letters. Not 1 or 2. At least 15, all dated across different years, all addressed to me, though the earliest one had been written when I was 9. The first line of the top letter said, "If you are reading this, then either I'm dead, your father finally told you the truth, or life got impatient and made the choice for both of us." I sat back hard in my chair. William had neat handwriting. Careful, almost formal. The kind of handwriting you'd expect from someone who thought before speaking, because he'd learned words could be taken back. The first few letters weren't confessions exactly. More like fragments. Stories. Warnings. Memories of my dad as a kid. My grandmother singing while washing dishes. The old neighborhood before the factory closed, and everybody started drinking more than they should. Then the letters got darker. He wrote about my grandfather's business failing in the late 90s. About debts the family didn't know existed. About my father, young, married, already with me as a baby, getting mixed up with a local man named Eddie Marrow, who did favors in exchange for silence. That phrase made my skin crawl. William wrote that Eddie wasn't officially a criminal, which somehow made him worse. He owned storage properties, financed desperate people, and liked keeping proof of what they owed. My grandfather had borrowed money. Then my dad had borrowed more trying to fix it. Then things spiraled. There were names, dates, amounts, and then came the part that made my hands shake. William said there had been a fire at one of Eddie Marrow's warehouses. The same fire from the clipping. The police suspected insurance fraud, but never proved it. According to the letter, my father had been there that night. Not William. My father. I read that sentence 3 times. William wrote that Dad had gone there to destroy records, debt ledgers, signed notes, documents that could have ruined half the family. My grandfather, my Aunt Paula's husband, even Grandma's house had secretly been collateral for one of the loans. If those papers surfaced, the family would lose everything. Dad wasn't supposed to start a fire. He was just supposed to take the boxes and leave. But something went wrong. William never wrote exactly what. Only, your father panicked. Fire moves faster than regret. The next paragraph hit even harder. I got there before the police did. Your father had blood on his sleeve, smoke in his lungs, and your name on his mouth. He kept saying you were 1 year old, and he couldn't go to prison. So I made a decision. I stopped reading, actually got up from the table, and paced my apartment. No chance. This had to be some bitter fantasy. A lie from a strange old man who wanted to rewrite history before he died. But then why hide it in my dad's garage? Why write it to me, and not to the whole family? Why spend years saying nothing? I sat back down and kept reading. William took responsibility for being at the warehouse. Not publicly enough to be jailed, but enough to absorb the family's hatred. Enough to make himself the obvious cause of whatever disaster had happened that year. He became the reckless brother, the screw-up, the one who dragged the family through hell. But the letters said that wasn't the full truth. He'd done it to keep the debt trail from pointing back to my father and grandfather. To keep my mother from finding out how close they'd come to losing the house while I was still in diapers. To keep Grandma from knowing her home had nearly been taken because of everyone else's pride. And maybe worst of all, to protect me and my sister from growing up with a father in prison. By the time I reached the bottom of the page, my pulse was hammering. I wanted to call my dad right then. Instead, I opened the second letter. That was the one that made me realize William hadn't been running from the family. He'd been staying away because it was the only way to keep the lie intact. The second letter was dated 6 years after the fire. I was 7 then, my sister was 4, and according to every family story, that was around the time Uncle William walked away from us. That phrase got repeated a lot growing up. He walked away. He chose his life. He made his bed. But William described it differently. He wrote that for a while after the warehouse fire, he tried staying close. He thought if he carried the blame quietly, maybe time would soften things. Maybe my father would recover. Maybe my grandfather would stop drinking. Maybe the family would settle into a version of peace. Instead, the opposite happened. Shame needs somewhere to live. If nobody admits it belongs to them, they shove it into the nearest person and call it justice. That line stopped me cold. William said my grandfather never forgave himself, but instead of confessing, he turned harder and meaner. My dad buried himself in work and silence. My aunt clung to the simplest story. William ruined everything. It was easier to hate one man than face how many people had helped build the disaster. So every holiday, every whispered conversation, every sour look became part of the sentence he'd accepted. He never defended himself. That part one couldn't understand. If someone accused me of destroying the family and I hadn't done it, I'd lose my mind. I'd throw evidence on the table. I'd drag the truth into daylight. I'd burn every relationship down before I let people spit on me for something I didn't do. William did none of that. Because, as he wrote, if he cleared his name, my father would lose his. Then came the memory that made everything personal. He wrote about my 8th birthday party. I actually remembered that one. Backyard barbecue. Plastic superhero plates. I'd gotten a bike with silver pegs I thought made me look older than I was. William wrote that he had brought me a toolbox set because I liked taking apart remote controls to see the bones inside. He stayed for less than an hour because Dad got stiff every time he was near me. There was one line underlined twice. Your father never hated me as much as he feared I would finally stop protecting him. I stared at that until the words blurred. There were more examples. More patterns. William paid for my grandmother's roof repair, but let my aunt believe it had come from an anonymous church fund. William covered one of my cousin's legal fees after a DUI and told the lawyer not to mention him. William sent money when Dad got laid off in 2009, routing it through Grandma, so no one would reject it out of pride. Every time the family was in danger of falling apart, the same man they mistrusted was the one holding some hidden piece of it together. He protected them materially, financially, quietly, and the family repaid him by treating him like a stain on the wallpaper. There was another letter clipped behind that one, shorter and rougher. No greeting, just a note. Distance was the price. They sleep better if I'm not in the room. Let them. Better they resent me than dig up what your father buried. Better children have an uneasy uncle than a broken home. I read that line over and over. An uneasy uncle than a broken home. That had been his calculation. Not justice. Not dignity. Us. Me. My sister. I leaned back in my chair and looked around my apartment like I might find some version of myself untouched by this. The walls looked the same. The refrigerator hummed. A car passed outside. But my whole childhood had shifted. All those years, I'd watched William stand alone at the edge of family events thinking he deserved it. Maybe he believed he did, partly. Maybe protecting people by lying for them still leaves dirt on your hands. But he hadn't abandoned us. He had sacrificed his place in the family, so the family could go on pretending it still deserved to exist. At 2:47 in the morning, I found the last page in the stack. It had only one sentence. Ask your grandmother what happened to the ledger. The next morning, I drove to her house before I'd even brushed my teeth. My grandmother opened the door in slippers and a wool cardigan, looking annoyed until she saw my face. Daniel? What happened? I held up the folder. That was all it took. Her expression dropped so fast it scared me. Not surprise exactly. More like the look of someone who has spent years bracing for one specific knock and has finally heard it. She stepped aside and let me in without a word. Grandma's house always smelled like coffee and lemon polish. It had been the center of our family for as long as I could remember, but that morning it felt different, smaller, older, too full of ghosts. She led me to the kitchen and sat down slowly. Where did you find that? In Dad's garage. She closed her eyes. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. The clock over the stove ticked like it was impatient. Then I said, tell me what happened to the ledger. She looked at me sharply. So William had been right. She knew exactly what I meant. Her hands trembled once, just once, before she folded them together on the table. Your uncle wrote to you. He wrote a lot. She swallowed hard. Then you know enough to be angry. That was the first honest thing anyone had said to me in years. I asked her if the letters were true. All of it. The debts. The warehouse. Dad being there. William taking the blame. She didn't answer immediately. Then she nodded. I wish she'd argued. I wish she'd called William a liar and given me some simple villain to hate. But she didn't. She just looked tired in a way I had never seen before. She told me my grandfather's machine repair business had been failing long before anyone admitted it. He borrowed money to keep up appearances, then more money to cover the first loans. Then Eddie Marrow showed up offering easy terms and impossible consequences. My father got dragged in trying to help. That's what good sons do in damaged families, she said bitterly. They inherit disasters and call it loyalty. According to her, the ledger was a handwritten record of every illegal loan, payoff, forged signature, and property note tied to Eddie's operation. If it got into the wrong hands, not only would there have been criminal charges, but civil judgments too. The house could have been taken. Dad and Grandpa could both have gone down. Maybe others. I asked if William had burned it. She shook her head. No, William took it. That made me sit up. He had it. For a while. Then she told me the part William hadn't written. After the warehouse fire, Eddie Merrow came to the house. Not to threaten them loudly. Men like that don't need volume. He came calm, almost polite, and told William that if the ledger ever surfaced, there would be consequences for everyone. Not just legal consequences. Real ones. So William disappeared for 3 weeks. No one knew where he went except Grandma. He took the ledger across state lines, hid it, and came back alone. When Eddie's people realized the ledger was gone for good, the pressure eased. Not completely, but enough. The danger shifted from immediate to dormant. That was why William had become the target inside the family. Because once the outside danger faded, nobody wanted to talk about how close they'd all come to being destroyed. So they let the story rot around him. I asked Grandma why she allowed that. Her eyes filled instantly. I told myself I was protecting my sons. That word sons cracked in the air between us. William made me promise, she whispered. He said Daniel and Lucy deserved a father they could look at without fear. He said your father was weak, not wicked, and that weak men can still be good fathers if life doesn't finish breaking them. I didn't know what to do with that. I was angry at my dad. Furious, actually. But some part of me hurt for him too. The younger version, the terrified one in smoke-stained clothes thinking he'd ruined all our lives. Then I asked the question that had been growing in my throat since I opened the folder. Why did William stay away from us? Grandma's face folded inward. Because the last time he tried to tell the truth, your father begged him not to. He kept coming back anyway. That was the worst part. Not that the family had misjudged him. That he knew we had, and still loved us enough to return. I left my grandmother's house shaking so hard I had to sit in my car for 10 minutes before I could drive. It's a strange thing to realize your family history is held together by one man's silence. All morning, memories kept rearranging themselves in my head. William watching through the kitchen window. William leaving early. William never defending himself. William always showing up when things were hardest. I thought about the year my dad got laid off, and somehow we never lost the house. I thought about my sister's hospital bills after she broke her arm skiing, and how Mom had cried with relief when something worked out with the insurance. I thought about all the tiny family emergencies that got solved without explanation. How many of them had William touched without wanting credit? By noon I was parked outside my parents' house. I didn't plan a speech. Didn't trust myself to. I just walked in, found my dad in the den watching some daytime sports show he clearly wasn't paying attention to, and dropped the folder on the coffee table. He looked at it, then at me, and in that instant, I knew he recognized it. He went pale in a way I had never seen before. My dad is not an expressive man. Even when Grandpa died, he cried once in the driveway, and then spent the funeral carrying chairs because it gave his hands something to do. But one look at that folder, and his whole face changed. Where did you get this? Garage. He nodded slowly, like the word made sense in a nightmare logic kind of way. I asked him if it was true. He didn't play dumb. He didn't ask what I meant. He just stared at the folder and said, "Your grandmother talked." That answer snapped something in me. No, I said. William talked. Finally. Dad flinched. I started then. All of it coming out too fast. How could you let this happen? How could you watch everyone treat him like that? How could you let me grow up believing he ruined us when he was the reason we stayed together? Dad sat there and took it for almost a minute before he said, very quietly, because he wouldn't let me fix it. I actually laughed at that. Not because it was funny, because it was unbelievable. You could have fixed it any day for 20 years. He made a choice. No, I snapped. He made a sacrifice. You made a habit. That landed. Dad stood up then, suddenly restless, pacing the length of the room. He told me he had tried, at first. After the fire, after the debts, after William hid the ledger. He said he offered to confess more than once. William refused every time. Said too much time had passed. Said the truth would destroy Grandma. Said my mother would leave. Said kids shouldn't lose their father because adults were cowards. I asked if any of that had just been convenient for him. Dad stopped pacing. Yes, he said. Just like that. No defense. No excuse. Just yes. Then he sat down again and looked about 15 years older. He admitted he got used to the arrangement. Used to William being the designated stain in the family story. Used to telling himself he would make it right later, when the timing was better, when Grandma was stronger, when I was older, when there was less to lose. But later calcified, and William kept carrying it. I asked Dad if he ever thanked him. Dad didn't answer. That was answer enough. Then he said something I still haven't fully gotten over. The reason I hated having him around you kids, he said, was because every time I looked at him, I remembered the man I should have been. That was the first moment I saw my father not as the solid center of our family, but as a man who had been living inside borrowed mercy for most of his life. I wanted to stay angry. I was angry, but he looked wrecked. Not theatrically guilty, not caught, just emptied out. I picked up the folder and asked one last question. Where is he? Dad blinked. William, yes. Where does he live? He gave me the address like he'd always known this day was coming. A small place 40 minutes outside town, near the river, in a county with more trees than people. I turned to leave. Daniel, he said. I stopped, but I didn't look back. He said, if you see him, tell him I was going to say it. I kept my hand on the doorknob and answered the only honest way I could. You should have said it 20 years ago. Then I left to find the man we'd all made into a villain. William lived in a one-story cabin with peeling green paint and a porch that looked one hard winter away from surrender. There was an old pickup in the driveway, stacked firewood by the side fence, and a rusted metal chair facing the river through a line of bare trees. The whole place felt like someone had chosen not loneliness exactly, but quiet. I stood at the front door longer than I should have. I'd imagined this moment all the way there. Me demanding answers. William finally explaining himself. Some dramatic collapse of years of tension. Instead, when he opened the door, he just looked mildly surprised and said, Daniel. Not, are you okay? Not, what are you doing here? Just my name. Like he'd expected me eventually. He stepped aside and let me in. The cabin was cleaner than I expected. Sparse. Neat. Bookshelves. Old records. A coffee mug on the table. A wood stove throwing off steady heat. There were framed photographs, but not many. One of Grandma holding me as a baby. One of my sister at a middle school art show. One of all of us at some long ago Christmas. Taken from a distance, like he'd asked someone else to snap it while he stood just out of frame. That hurt more than I can explain. He asked if I wanted coffee. I said no. He nodded and sat across from me at the kitchen table like this was a normal Tuesday, and not the moment his entire role in my life had just been ripped open. I put the folder down between us. He looked at it once and sighed. So, he said. Life got impatient. I stared at him. You knew I'd find out. I knew secrets get old. That answer made me angrier than if he'd lied. I asked him why he never told me. Why he let me believe the worst. Why he let all of us believe it. He didn't rush his response. Because children shouldn't have to carry adult wreckage, he said. And later it seemed selfish to reopen it for my own sake. For your own sake? I almost shouted. You gave up your whole life with this family. He held my gaze. No, I gave up being understood by them. That's not the same as giving up my life. I didn't know what to do with that. So I pushed harder. I asked if he resented my father. If he hated him. If he ever regretted stepping in. William leaned back, looking not offended but tired. I was furious with him, he said. For years. Still am, some days. But hatred is expensive, Daniel. I had enough costs already. That line shut me up. Then I asked the question I'd been circling since I left Grandma's. Were you really protecting us? Or were you protecting him? William looked out the window toward the trees. Both, he said. But mostly you kids. He explained it in the plainest terms possible. If Dad had gone down, my mother would have taken me and my sister and left. She would have been right too. Grandma would have lost the house. My grandfather would have drunk himself into the grave even faster. Aunt Paula's family would have been dragged into lawsuits. The whole thing would have splintered publicly and permanently. Families survive a lot, William said. But public shame mixed with money? That kills them. I hated that he was probably right. Then came the twist I wasn't expecting. He told me he did try once to force the truth out. About 10 years ago, after my grandfather died, William met with Dad privately and said it was over. Enough time had passed. The truth needed to be shared. Dad agreed at first. Then my sister Lucy got sick that winter. Not life-threatening, but bad enough that money got tight and fear got louder. Dad panicked all over again. Begged William for one more year. Then another. Then another. Weak men can still be good fathers, William had written. Sitting across from him, I realized he'd been giving my father chance after chance to become brave. He never had. I asked William why he kept coming to family gatherings if it hurt so much. That answer was the one that cracked me. Because you and Lucy never looked at me the way the others did when you were little, he said. And after that, because I wanted to make sure the family I helped keep alive was still alive. Simple, brutal, honest. Then he reached over, tapped the folder lightly, and said, I didn't write those so you'd hate your father. I laughed once, bitter and exhausted. That's not really up to you. No, he said. But what you do next is. And that was when I realized this wasn't over. Because now I knew the truth. And the family didn't. I thought I would leave William's cabin with certainty. Instead, I left with a war in my chest. Part of me wanted to tell everyone immediately. Group text. Family dinner. Drop the truth like a grenade and let people choke on it. Let my aunt remember every cold look she'd given him. Let my cousins rethink every joke about weird Uncle William. Let my father finally stand in the exact light he'd avoided for decades. But another part of me understood the trap. William had spent 20 years protecting the family from collapse. If I exposed everything recklessly, was I honoring him, or undoing the one thing he sacrificed himself to preserve? I didn't sleep that night either. The next day, my sister Lucy called me. She's 26, sharper than me in most ways, and she immediately knew something was wrong. Did Dad say something to you? I told her we needed to talk in person. By evening, she was sitting on my couch reading the letters in complete silence. She always reads fast, but this time she slowed down in spots, eyes scanning lines more than once, as if repetition might make them less real. When she finished, she set the pages down very carefully. Then she said, "Oh my God," not loudly, not dramatically, just hollow. I filled in the parts Grandma and William had told me. Lucy cried once, angrily, wiping her face like she resented the tears. "I hugged Dad this morning," she said. "I made him coffee. And he knows this every day?" "Yeah." She looked at me with that same fury I felt. And William still came to my art shows. That detail broke something in both of us. Because he'd come to 2 of her school exhibits and stood near the back with a bouquet wrapped in grocery store paper because fancy florists probably felt unnecessary to him. Lucy had once told me she thought he came because he liked quiet rooms. Now we knew he came because he liked us. Or loved us. Maybe that's the right word, even if he'd never used it. Lucy asked what we were going to do. Before I could answer, my phone buzzed. It was my Aunt Paula. Sunday dinner at Grandma's. Everyone invited. Apparently Grandma had decided we were doing a family supper because we don't gather enough anymore. Lucy and I looked at each other instantly. Grandma knew. This wasn't random. The dinner felt like a fuse. All Sunday afternoon, I kept thinking maybe Dad would finally confess before we got there. Maybe Grandma had already warned him that the truth was moving now, whether he liked it or not. Maybe he'd grow a spine in the last possible second. He didn't. When Lucy and I arrived, the house was already full. My aunt, my cousins, Dad, Mom, even William, standing near the window with his hands in his pockets, looking like he'd been invited to his own sentencing. Our eyes met across the room. He knew. Of course he knew. Grandma had done something deliberate bringing him there. And from the look on Dad's face, he knew the ground beneath him was gone. Dinner was unbearable. Everyone talking too brightly. Too much clatter. Too much fake normal. I watched my aunt ask William to pass the bread without once looking him in the eye. Watched my cousin Mark complain about his landlord while William quietly fixed a wobbling chair leg with a folded napkin under one foot. Same old pattern. Same unseen labor. Lucy gripped her wine glass so tightly I thought it might break. Then Grandma set down her fork and said, "Before dessert, there's something this family should have said a long time ago." The room went silent so fast it felt staged. Dad closed his eyes. My aunt frowned. "Mom." Grandma looked at William first. Not at Dad. At William. And in a voice that shook but did not fail, she said, "I let this family blame the wrong son." Nobody moved. I heard my own heartbeat. My aunt actually laughed once, confused. "What are you talking about?" Grandma turned to my father. The whole table followed her gaze. And just like that, after 2 decades of myth, the truth started clawing its way into the room. I've replayed that dinner in my head 100 times, and what I remember most is not the shouting. It's the silence right before it. The moment after Grandma said, "I let this family blame the wrong son," and every person at that table looked at my father as if some buried instinct had always known where to look when the lights finally came on. Dad didn't speak. Grandma did. Not all of it. She spared details where she could. She didn't mention every debt or every humiliation. She told the truth the way older people sometimes do when they're finally exhausted enough to stop decorating it. She said there had been money trouble. Serious trouble. She said my father and grandfather had gotten in over their heads with dangerous people. She said there was a fire, a cover-up, and a decision made out of panic and love and cowardice. She said William stepped in and carried blame that should never have been his alone. My Aunt Paula kept interrupting at first. "No, that's not possible," William always said. Frank told us. That last one died on her lips because Frank was my grandfather, and suddenly his absence felt less dignified and more strategic. Then Grandma said the one sentence nobody could dodge. William protected this family, and we repaid him with suspicion. You could feel the air change. My cousin Mark stared openly at William like he was seeing an actual human being for the first time. Jenna started crying. My mother sat frozen with one hand over her mouth. Lucy looked at Dad with such raw disappointment I almost had to look away. And William? William didn't bask in any of it. Didn't say, "I told you so." Didn't defend himself. Didn't make a speech. He just sat there looking almost uncomfortable, as if the truth was somehow more embarrassing than the lie. Finally, Aunt Paula turned on Dad. Not dramatic, not loud at first, just this stunned, disgusted whisper. "You let us do that to him?" Dad nodded once. That's when the room exploded. Questions, accusations, disbelief. How long? Who knew? Did Mom know? Did William really pay for this, cover that, do all those things? Was that why he disappeared? Was that why Grandma always defended him just enough to keep him in the room, but never enough to clear him? Dad answered some of it. Not well, but honestly enough. He admitted William saved him. He admitted fear kept turning into delay, and delay into a life. He admitted he had no excuse that didn't sound smaller out loud. Then Lucy stood up. She walked around the table to William, and for one terrible second, I thought she might not know what to say. None of us did. Instead, she bent down and hugged him. William froze. Actually froze. Like no one had touched him with uncomplicated affection in so long his body didn't recognize it immediately. Then one of his hands lifted and rested on her back. My aunt started crying harder. I don't know what came over me, but I stood too. Went around the other side. Put a hand on his shoulder. He looked up at me with this expression I'll never forget. Not relief exactly, but shock cracked open by gratitude. That was the proof, more than the letters. Not the story, not the confessions. That look, the face of a man realizing maybe the family he protected for 20 years had finally decided to see him. Dad stood then too, but he didn't come closer. He just said, voice breaking, "Vic, I'm sorry." William looked at him for a long time. The whole room waited. Then he said, "I know. Not forgiveness. Not punishment. Just truth." And somehow that was harder to hear than if he'd yelled. The dinner fell apart after that. People crying in corners, Grandma praying in the living room, my mother asking questions she probably should have asked 20 years earlier, my aunt apologizing to William in fragments that didn't seem big enough for the weight they were trying to lift. Nothing got magically fixed. That's not how families work. But the lie died that night. And once it was dead, everything else had to learn how to breathe without it. It's been 8 months since that dinner. Long enough for the first shock to settle. Not long enough for the damage to disappear. Families don't heal in a speech. They heal in awkward phone calls, changed habits, and whether people act differently when the story is no longer convenient. My aunt invites William inside now instead of leaving the door open like he's a delivery guy. My cousins ask him questions and actually listen to the answers. My mother calls him by his name. Small things, huge things. Dad started seeing him once a week. I know because Grandma told me, and because Dad looks wrung out afterward, but lighter too. Like confession can still work even when it shows up 20 years late. He and William aren't magically close. They probably never will be. Some fractures don't vanish. But they're speaking honestly now, and maybe for men like them, that counts as a miracle. As for me, I visit William at the cabin twice a month. Sometimes we talk, sometimes we don't. He taught me how to patch a screen door properly, how to split wood without wasting motion, how to listen to old blues records on a turntable that looks older than both of us. He's still quiet, still careful with words. But once you stop mistaking silence for coldness, you notice how much warmth can fit inside it. A few weeks ago, I asked him why he kept the letters all those years. He was sanding down a warped drawer front on his porch, and he didn't answer right away. Then he said, "I wanted there to be a version of me left behind that wasn't decided by the room." That line has stayed with me, because that's what my family did to him. We let the room decide who he was. The whispers, the tension, the easy story, the villain everyone could point at so nobody had to touch the uglier truth. And once a family decides who the burden bearer is, it gets very comfortable setting things on his back. I think about my childhood now, and it feels split in two. There's the version I lived, where Uncle William was the strange, distant man nobody trusted. And there's the version underneath it, the real one, where he was the reason my home stayed standing, the reason my father stayed my father, the reason our family got the chance to become better than the story it told about itself. He didn't protect us perfectly. He lied. He enabled. He disappeared when honesty might have forced change sooner. He knows that. I know that. But none of that erases what matters most. For years, I thought he stayed away because he didn't care enough to come close. The truth was worse and better. He stayed away because caring was exactly what made him do it. Last Sunday, we had dinner at Grandma's again. Nothing dramatic. Pot roast, too many rolls, my cousin's baby throwing peas off a high chair. William sat at the table this time, not near the wall, not by the exit. In the middle, Lucy was showing him sketches from a freelance project, and he was pretending not to be proud, which fooled nobody. At one point I looked around the room and realized something simple and devastating. For the first time in my life, nobody was treating him like a man they had to tolerate. He looked older than I remembered, softer too. And I had this sharp, sudden grief for all the years we lost because the family needed a scapegoat more than it wanted the truth. I can't get those years back for him. None of us can. But I can say this now, and mean it with everything I've got. We misjudged that man for most of my life. We called him distant when he was burdened. We called him guilty when he was loyal. We called him the problem when, all along, he was the one holding the rest of us together. And somehow, after all that, he kept showing up anyway.